This is going to be part of a debate I'm doing, and the issue I'm doing here is on same-sex marriage. And get this ready. And it's going to be between me and a user named BeatMasterPhil. It's going to be more of a civilized discussion, not the full of shit series that I was doing before, but this is going to be more of a civilized discussion. So this is going to be the debate. This part, he already made his arguments and his claims. This is going to be my response to his claims. I'm going to go ahead and send this video to him so he can take a look at it and respond to it. If you haven't already, I also recommend that you go into full screen mode, because there's going to be a lot of information and data presented here, and you're going to want full screen so you can see all of it. So these are the general positions. BeatMasterPhil is against same-sex marriage, believes that homosexuals should not marry, and I'm for it. Now I'm going to be responding to his argument and explain why I don't think his argument stands up to scrutiny. Then I'm going to explain why gays should be allowed to get married and what I think about marriage. And I'm also going to show what I think about marriage throughout this video. So there's going to be a lot of information in this video. It looks like I'm going to have to divide it into several sections. So this is his argument raw form, and this is also why I encouraged you to use full screen. So these are basically the entire set of claims he made for the argument. And I believe that I was able to refine his argument in basically this form. It's a conditional argument, a modus ponens, a categorical modus ponens. So what he is basically using is the procreation argument. Basically, if a relationship, such as a man and a woman, has the potential to procreate, then that relationship can get a marriage. So if two couples can have the potential to procreate, then they can marry. The second premise is heterosexuals, which are the R of the first premise, do have the ability to potentially procreate, and therefore heterosexuals can get married. So this is his argument. Alright, so if the criteria here is P, if R equals P, whatever variable you have, heterosexuals, if they are P, then they are M. If they have the potential to procreate, then they can get married. Let's go ahead and expand this argument a little bit. Premise 1. If the relation is potentially naturally procreating and has the act of, and does so through the act of heterosexual sex, then the relation is a marriage. So if you have a relationship between a man and a woman, for example, and they can naturally procreate, or the potential to do so through the act of heterosexual, sexual or sexual activity, then they can have a valid marriage. Anyone who doesn't cannot have a valid marriage. That is basically BeatMaster's argument. The second premise, obviously, heterosexual relations are potentially naturally procreating and include the act of heterosexual sex. And therefore the conclusion is that, heterosexuals can get married. They constitute a marriage. So let's do evaluation part 1 of the argument. As I mentioned earlier, this argument is valid. It's a modus ponens categorical argument. It's a type of modus ponens argument. And the second premise is obviously true. Obviously the second premise is true. So the focus will be on the first premise. It will be on the first premise. However, even right now I can see some problems with this argument. Even if the argument was sound, that is to say that the argument is valid as it is, all the premises are true, all the premises have met their burden of proof. In other words, there's enough sufficient evidence to warrant the warrant the premises and support them. And the argument is fallacy free, even if it met those 4 criteria, or meets one of them. It still will not prove that gays cannot get married. It will only prove that procreation is a criteria, but not the criteria. Now, this is where we get into 2 different possibilities of his argument. I'm not sure which one he is using. It could be the case that his argument is just a regular conditional argument. If that is the case, then it does not sufficiently prove that gays cannot get married, because it would only prove that procreation is a criteria, but it doesn't. I don't think it does enough, even after my whole evaluation, to prove that it is the only criteria. Now, he could be going the other road. He could be using a biconditional argument. Basically, if and only if a relationship is naturally potentially procreating, then it's marriage. Basically, he's saying that the only criteria for marriage is procreation. If that's the case, and he could prove his argument to be true, his argument to be sound, sorry. If he could prove his argument to be sound, then that would prove that homosexuals cannot get married. But here's the problem I have with that. I'm going to go ahead and give you a sneak peek. Basically, I haven't found this argument to be, as a biconditional argument, to be compelling enough. I haven't seen enough reason. He hasn't given enough reasons to show that that's the only criteria. So it would be much easier to use just the regular conditional, but I'm not sure which one he's using. But either way, the issue here is the burden of proof. With the biconditional argument has an issue with the burden of proof. I don't think the burden of proof has been met. So I'm going to be going through all this throughout this video. Biconditional has not met its burden of proof. And the regular conditional would only prove that it's a criteria, not the criteria. But there's so many more reasons why the argument, conditional or biconditional, does fail. So I'm going to go ahead and go into more of those now. So this is the first premise, the main premise. The argument depends on this premise. So in this premise P, so go ahead and write this down, write down the argument, write down the first premise, and go ahead and write down the variable P, because that's going to be very important to this argument. P is the objective ground for marriage, according to BeatMasterPhil. It is the objective ground. That's going to be the central variable in this entire argument. So what is P? It is potential for procreation in the active heterosexual sex. It is the potential for natural procreation through heterosexual sex. That's what P is. So now we know what P is, let's go and evaluate further. So I asked him, why is P the objective? Why this variable? Why not something else? And this is his raw defense of P. So go ahead and take a good look at it. And now I'm going to go ahead and show you the refined version. So this is basically the main points of his defense. There are three. One is what I like to call the dilemma. The dilemma justification is the first justification. Basically, either we have an objective ground or anything goes. We have an objective ground or anything goes. That's the first justification. The second justification is the what should I call this one? The perpetuation justification. That's the second one. The third is the government justification. So these are the three justifications for the variable P, for the potential procreations. So go ahead and write down these three. These are going to be very important to the structure of the argument and the proper evaluation of that. So let's go ahead and evaluate the first justification, the dilemma. We need to have some sort of objective ground unless we want it to be the case that any person can marry any person or anything for any reason. Basically, we have an objective ground or anything goes. That's the dilemma here. We have these two options. Well, the problem is, those are not the only two options. There are actually at least 5 choices, at least. There could be more. These are the real choices. Static objective ground, dynamic objective ground, relative objective ground, relative dynamic ground, and anything goes. So, static objective ground would be basically an objective reason for marriage. And it would not change through time. It would be completely static, unchanging. So static is an objective ground that is unchanging. Dynamic, option 2, is a objective ground that is dynamic. It does change, but it's objective. Then there's option 3, relative objective ground. That is an objective ground that is relative to different cultures, different societies, and even different times. Think of it like time. Time is objective and relative. It's objective because it exists the way it does, regardless of what I think about it. It's relative. Again, Einstein's theory of general relativity. Time is not the same for everyone. Time can be different for different people. Time here on Earth is slightly different than it is in outer space. In some parts of space, like near black holes, there are radical differences between time. Then there's relative dynamic ground. Basically, there is no objective ground. Marriage is completely dynamic, changes through time, and relative to different cultures. Depends on the culture and depends on the time. In option 5, anything goes. So we found a fallacy in the first justification. The fallacy of false dichotomy, false dilemma. And there's a reason why this fallacy is significant. Now, I think P is a static objective ground. It could be dynamic. It's either dynamic or statically objective, but I do think it's static. The reason why the false dichotomy is a problem is because it excludes what I find to be really what marriage is. Number 4, marriage is actually relatively dynamic. So the false dichotomy excluded the truth of marriage, and I'll explain why this is what marriage actually is. The reality is that marriage is very dynamic in relative to culture and time. Marriage has had many different forms and has served many different purposes. There's not one single basis for marriage throughout history. Therefore, P is false in the first premise, and the first premise of the argument is false. Again, if marriage is not P, if it is relatively dynamic, then variable P is in trouble, and therefore the first premise is in trouble. Now, it could be the case that, procreation, could have been in almost every marriage throughout history, but the point here is that marriage has had many different forms and has served many different purposes besides procreation. Procreation has not always been the only thing of marriage. There's been other purposes. So again, we're back to that issue where procreation could just be a criteria, but not the criteria. And this is what this fact proves. Procreation is just a criteria, but it's not the criteria. It's not the main criteria. So we have a false premise with the first justification. The first justification is false. But it doesn't stop there. Some societies have had polygamous marriages, and these marriages were recognized as marriages. Even some societies still today allow polygamous marriages. It's not uncommon in some parts of the world. Again, these are actual marriages in these parts of the world. They're completely recognized by marriage. They recognize that as marriage. They've been doing it for quite some time. Some marriages, women had no power, little to no power. And so marriage has been about sexual pleasure of the husband and the wife. And the wife was nothing more than a sex toy. Some marriages were about money and family relationships, not about love or procreation. And throughout much of human history, again, women had very little rights. Some of them could even decide who the husband would be, and if their husband was a jerk, they couldn't divorce. So again, these were, for a long time, Marriage was arranged by the family, and the women had no choice in the matter.